Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. The City of Silk and Spies. Life in medieval Damascus. Close your eyes and imagine the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and dust. You hear the distant bleating of goats, the rhythmic thump of a weaver's loom, and the faint call of the muezzin echoing from a 1,000-year-old minaret. Welcome to Damascus, the city of silk and spies. This city, resting at the crossroads of East and West, has stood longer than memory itself. Some say it is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. In the medieval centuries, Damascus was not just a city. It was a heart that pulsed with silk, with secrets, with the slow, deliberate rhythm of empire. The phrase, City of Silk and Spies, comes from the way medieval travelers spoke of Damascus. Silk, for its legendary textile markets, the workshops of fine weavers whose shimmering fabrics were coveted by merchants from Venice, Cairo, and Samarkand. And spies, for the quiet, unseen web of diplomacy, trade secrets, and political intrigues that wound through its bazaars and palaces like invisible smoke. From the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th century to the Crusades and the rise of the Mamluks, Damascus was both a jewel and a battlefield, a place where cultures met, clashed, and blended. If you were standing in Damascus in the 12th century, you would be standing in the middle of a miracle of trade. The Silk Road, that ancient artery connecting China to the Mediterranean, passed through here like a river of wealth. Caravans arrived from the east, their camels heavy with silk, jade, paper, and spices. From the west came merchants bringing silver, glass, and fine armor. And in between, in the narrow, winding souks of Damascus, everything changed hands. Imagine walking through Al-Hamidiyya souk centuries ago. The air warm and close, filled with murmurs in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Armenian. The metallic clink of scales as merchants weighed silk threads finer than breath. Sandalwood smoke coiling in the air. 1,000 eyes watching you from the shadows of carved wooden stalls. Some curious, some cautious, some calculating. Because in Damascus, trade was never only trade. Every deal was also a story. Every merchant a potential spy. In the age of crusades, every kingdom had its agents here. Latin knights disguised as merchants. Arab scribes passing coded letters in baskets of figs. Jewish and Armenian traders carrying whispers between Cairo, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. The city itself was a crossroads not only of silk but of strategy. To hold Damascus was to hold the doorway between Arabia and Anatolia, between the desert and the sea. That is why rulers guarded it not just with soldiers, but with silence, with secrets that moved like shadows in the night. A traveler in those days might have passed through the city and seen only beauty, the marble fountains, the orchards of Ghouta, the blue tiles of the Umayyad mosque catching the sun. But beneath that peace, there was always listening, watching. A merchant's ledger might hide a spy's code. A silk parcel might conceal a letter meant for a distant king. And a smile across a market stall might mean far more than it seemed. Let us walk softly through one of the most sacred places in all of Islam, the Great Mosque of Damascus. Its vast courtyard glows like polished bone in the afternoon light. Pigeons circle above the golden mosaics that shimmer with images of paradise. Vines, gardens, rivers. Beneath those mosaics lies a story older than the mosque itself. For this place was once a Roman temple to Jupiter, then a Christian church of St. John the Baptist, before the Umayyad caliphs transformed it into one of the grandest mosques in the world. Within its cool stone halls, scholars debated philosophy, poets whispered verses, and travelers found rest. It was here that ideas moved silently from one civilization to another, translated, absorbed, reborn. Greek became Arabic, science became scripture, and Damascus became a bridge, a living archive of human thought. If you wandered south from the mosque, past the copper shops and the scent of roasting almonds, you'd reach the weaver's quarter. Here looms clattered like 1,000 beating hearts. Men and women worked by lamplight, their fingers deft and sure, drawing patterns older than dynasties. The famous damask fabric, soft, reversible, rich in pattern, was born here. Each design held a secret geometry, an echo of Persian gardens or Byzantine mosaics, woven into silk so fine it seemed to hold its own light. Merchants from Venice called it Damaskina. Traders from Cairo called it Dimashqi. Everywhere, it carried the city's name, Damascus silk. And yet, while silk glittered in the sunlight, other kinds of threads were being woven in the dark. Threads of information, alliances, betrayal. An ambassador might visit a silk merchant not for cloth, but for news. A courier might hide a royal decree within a bolt of fabric. And a smile could mean a secret deal between rivals. The souks of Damascus were like veins, carrying life and rumor alike. In Souk al-Bzuriya, traders whispered about prices, yes, but also about movements of armies, arrivals of envoys, deaths of kings. Some stalls sold herbs, but some herbs were poisons. Some books were poetry. Others were codes. And in a corner tea shop, an old storyteller might murmur of distant wars and changing borders, while a man beside him took mental notes for his master. Everything in Damascus was layered. Beauty and danger, piety and cunning. The city smiled like a courtesan and prayed like a saint. Can you hear it now, the hum of that ancient city? The hiss of silk sliding through fingers. The faint metallic ring of a sword hidden beneath robes. The breath of a messenger running through narrow alleys. That was life in medieval Damascus. A city of gardens, gold, and guarded whispers. By the 12th century, Damascus had become the principal city of Syria and one of the most vital centers in the Islamic world. Its location made it indispensable, lying between the Mediterranean ports of Antioch and Tripoli to the west and the vast deserts leading toward Baghdad and Mecca to the east. Whoever held Damascus controlled the routes that carried silk from the Far East, spices from India, glassware from Syria itself, and intelligence from every corner of the known world. The city's geography was its power. Damascus lay at the base of the anti-Lebanon mountains, nourished by the Barada River, and surrounded by the fertile Ghouta oasis, an agricultural zone that supported orchards, vineyards, and vegetable gardens. This oasis fed the city and its army, allowing Damascus to sustain long sieges and serve as a staging ground for military campaigns. During the Crusader period, both Christian and Muslim armies recognized the necessity of Damascus. For the Crusaders, it represented the eastern barrier of the Holy Land. For Muslim rulers, it was the front line of defense and the heart of political coordination against the Latin kingdoms. When Nur ad-Din Zengi made Damascus his capital in 1154, he transformed it into an administrative and military hub. His successors, including the Ayyubids under Saladin, continued this approach. The city's officials maintained networks of informants who reported on Crusader movements in the coastal cities and on political shifts among rival Muslim states in Aleppo, Mosul, and Cairo. Intelligence was gathered through merchants, travelers, and local notables. Information was as valuable as gold, and rulers of Damascus ensured they received it first. Under Saladin's rule, 1174 to 1193, Damascus became a command center for military coordination and espionage. Saladin understood the necessity of intelligence in warfare. His court employed scouts and secret messengers to monitor both enemy and ally. Damascus, with its bustling markets and constant influx of foreigners, served as an ideal base for such activity. Merchants and caravan leaders were frequently employed as couriers. Their movements seemed ordinary, but they carried coded letters, maps, and directives. Some reports were written in invisible ink made from plant extracts, revealed only by heat or specific chemical compounds. Others were disguised within trade manifests, hidden in bundles of silk or spice. The city's mosques and madrasas also played indirect roles in intelligence work. Scholars and travelers passed through these institutions, bringing with them knowledge of distant lands, from the fortifications of Frankish castles to the political intrigues of Byzantine courts. This information, when gathered and analyzed, helped rulers anticipate threats and opportunities. The fame of Damascene crafts made the city not only a hub of trade but also a target of industrial espionage. The art of producing damask silk, known for its intricate reversible patterns, was closely guarded. The weavers' guilds of Damascus were organized and secretive, protecting their methods from outsiders. European merchants, particularly from Venice and Genoa, sought to learn these techniques to reproduce them at home. Some traders bribed local artisans. Others attempted to smuggle pattern samples or skilled weavers out of the city. The authorities often punished such acts severely, viewing them as theft against the city's wealth and prestige. The glass industry of Damascus was similarly protected. Syrian glassmakers were renowned for their innovations. From enameled lamps used in mosques to delicate goblets exported across the Mediterranean. Techniques involving metallic oxides for coloring and glazing were guarded as family secrets. Travelers from the West, such as the 12th century Jewish merchant Benjamin of Tudela, recorded how carefully these crafts were controlled and how the city's economy depended on preserving such monopolies. Damascus contained numerous caravanserais, large fortified inns where traders and travelers rested. These structures, such as Khan Azad Pasha and its earlier medieval equivalents, functioned as centers of information exchange. Couriers moving between Cairo, Baghdad, and Anatolia stopped here, bringing news of wars, treaties, and market fluctuations. Letters found in the Cairo Genizah, a collection of medieval Jewish documents, reveal how traders based in Damascus communicated across vast distances. They discussed prices, shipments, and sometimes political conditions, providing an unfiltered glimpse of the region's networked intelligence. These communications show that merchants served as both economic and political agents, intentionally or not. Following Saladin's death, Damascus oscillated between Ayyubid princes, each vying for control. Despite internal disputes, the city maintained its centrality. It continued to produce luxury textiles, metalwork, and weaponry that sustained both economy and defense. During the 13th century, the Mongol invasions threatened Syria. In 1260, Damascus fell temporarily to Hulagu Khan's forces, who destroyed parts of the city and disrupted its industries. Yet, after the Mongols were defeated by the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut, Damascus came under Mamluk rule and quickly revived. The Mamluks, who governed from Cairo, recognized Damascus's intelligence value. They established a system of mounted couriers, the Berid, connecting Cairo and Damascus. Reports of political unrest, enemy incursions, and trade fluctuations traveled through this network. The speed of these messengers often determined military success. Under the Mamluks, Damascus was also an intellectual center. Scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah and historians like Abu Shama wrote from within its walls. Their works provide insight into how information was managed and transmitted. Diplomats from the Mongol Ilkhanate, the Byzantine Empire, and various European states visited the city, negotiating trade and truces. Every delegation brought interpreters, scribes, and often spies. These envoys stayed in official residences but were closely watched. Local informants reported on their movements and conversations. The Mamluk Secretariat maintained records of all foreign visitors, their gifts, and the messages they carried. Intelligence was bureaucratized, collected, categorized, and used for policy. Despite its guarded atmosphere, Damascus remained open to cultural exchange. The city's artisans adapted motifs from Persia, Anatolia, and even Europe, incorporating them into local designs. Arabic calligraphy, Persian floral patterns, and Byzantine geometry coexisted on the same piece of silk or brass. This fusion reflected both the openness of commerce and the vigilance of state control. Every pattern and symbol held meaning, and every merchant might hold an allegiance. By the late 13th century, Damascus had become a center not just of craftsmanship and scholarship but of coordination, a place where the world's economies, armies, and secrets intersected. When the Mamluks took full control of Damascus in 1260 after defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut, the city entered a new phase of political and cultural development. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruled from Cairo, recognized Damascus not only as a provincial capital but as one of the pillars of the entire empire. It served as both a strategic outpost and an administrative brain, the northern shield of Egypt and the southern gate to Anatolia. The Mamluks governed Damascus through a hierarchy of appointed officials. The most powerful of these was the Naib al-Sultan, the Sultan's deputy, who acted as governor and represented Cairo's authority. Beneath him were wali's overseeing various districts, and a complex bureaucracy that maintained taxation, trade regulation and security. The administration preserved many of the Ayyubid structures but expanded them. Damascus was divided into quarters, each with a mutasib, an inspector responsible for market ethics and product standards. The mutasib ensured that weights and measures were fair, that merchants paid proper dues, and that the city's guilds followed regulations. His office reports, preserved in some legal manuscripts, offer a glimpse of a tightly controlled yet vibrant urban economy. Craftsmen in Damascus were organized into guilds, asnaf, which functioned as both trade associations and local authorities. Each guild elected a sheikh al-Sinare, chief of craft, who represented his members to the government. Guilds regulated apprenticeship, quality, prices, and often played roles in defense and public works. The Silk Weavers Guild was among the most prestigious. Silk production required several stages: reeling, dyeing, weaving, and finishing, each managed by specialized groups. Damascene silk was famed for its complexity of design, produced on drawlooms that allowed artisans to create geometric and floral motifs. Weavers guarded these patterns jealously, passing them through family lines or trusted apprentices. The city also contained guilds for armorers, swordsmiths, coppersmiths, and tanners. Damascus steel, known for its strength and characteristic watered pattern, was produced using Wootz ingots imported from India. The smiths of the city refined these with great precision, and the blades they created were exported across the Islamic world. The production of weaponry was not merely commercial, it was strategic. The authorities monitored swordsmiths closely, ensuring that no weapons were sold to unauthorized persons or foreign agents. Damascus, though prosperous, was always conscious of vulnerability. The Mongol invasion of 1260 had demonstrated how quickly power could shift. The Mamluks reinforced the city's walls, repaired the citadel, and stationed garrisons throughout its quarters. The citadel of Damascus, originally built during the Seljuk period and expanded by Saladin, became the core of military control. Its towers and gates were repaired, and a permanent garrison housed there. The governor's residence was within its walls, emphasizing the unity of civil and military power. Barracks surrounded the city, housing the Mamluk cavalry, slave soldiers of Turkic and Circassian origin trained from youth in horsemanship and warfare. These soldiers formed the elite defense force and occasionally suppressed local revolts or rival factions. The Mamluk authorities maintained strict surveillance over the population. Any gathering or rumor of sedition was investigated swiftly. As the city prospered, foreign merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Catalonia began establishing commercial relations. These Western traders were allowed to operate under specific conditions. They resided in designated caravanserais, often under watch, and their goods were inspected by customs officers, al-Dawawin. The Mamluks imposed detailed tariffs on imported items, coral, cloth, metals, and spices, ensuring that Damascus benefited from transit trade. The Diwan al-Tijara, Department of Trade, recorded these transactions and monitored the flow of goods. Merchants were required to declare both the value and origin of their cargo. Espionage and information gathering occurred naturally through these contacts. Venetian traders, for example, reported to their consuls and occasionally to their government about regional conditions. Similarly, Muslim merchants who traveled to Europe brought back intelligence on political affairs and maritime developments. The Mamluk Chancery analyzed such information to shape foreign policy and safeguard the routes connecting Cairo, Damascus, and the ports of Alexandria and Latakia. The Mamluk rulers understood the symbolic power of architecture. In Damascus, they sponsored the restoration of mosques, madrasas, and konkas, Sufi lodges. The city became a showcase of Islamic art, with intricate stonework, calligraphy, and wooden mashrabiyas adorning public buildings. The Umayyad Mosque remained the city's spiritual nucleus. Mamluk sultans sent funds for its upkeep, and scholars continued to teach there. Around the mosque grew numerous madrasas, including the Madrasa al-Adaliyah and Madrasa al-Zahariya, which trained judges and theologians. These institutions also served as places of record-keeping and communication. Scholars and administrators corresponded with other cities, indirectly facilitating the spread of information. Damascus was also home to large Sufi communities. Orders like the Qadariya and Rifa'iyya maintained lodges where travelers and pilgrims stayed. Through them, ideas and news circulated rapidly across the Islamic world. While Sufi networks primarily served religious functions, their geographic spread meant they could also transmit information, voluntarily or not, between distant regions. The population of Damascus during the Mamluk period is estimated to have ranged between 100,000 and 150,000, making it one of the largest cities in the Middle East. Its urban landscape was defined by narrow alleys, covered markets, courtyards, and gardens. The Ghouta oasis remained essential, irrigated by canals that distributed the Barada River's water to orchards and fields. The economy was diversified. Besides textiles, the city exported soap, dried fruit, and leather. The Souk al-Hamadiyya, though expanded later under the Ottomans, had medieval predecessors that were equally bustling. Each trade occupied its section: perfumes in one lane, booksellers in another, metalsmiths in yet another. The city's notables, scholars, merchants, and judges formed a self-conscious elite known as the ulama and ayyan. They managed endowments, awqaf, that funded schools, fountains, and hospitals. This system tied wealth to piety but also to influence. Control over endowments gave families power independent of the state. The Mamluk authorities balanced this by appointing inspectors and occasionally confiscating property under the pretext of corruption. The Mamluks enforced strict legal order through the Qadi system. Damascus hosted multiple judges, each representing a Sunni legal school: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali. This ensured inclusivity within the orthodox framework. The Mutasib, mentioned earlier, complemented the judiciary by overseeing morality in markets, ensuring that gambling, fraud, and public immorality were curtailed. The city's prisons, located near the citadel, held common criminals as well as political detainees. Records describe interrogations and punishments, but also the bureaucratic precision of legal documentation. The emphasis on documentation extended into all state affairs. Damascus was a city of paper: contracts, ledgers, decrees, reflecting an advanced administrative culture. Throughout the 14th century, Damascus faced repeated challenges: plagues, earthquakes, and occasional Mongol or Turkmen incursions. Yet, it continued to recover quickly due to its fertile surroundings and the resilience of its institutions. The Black Death of 1348 to 1349 killed a significant portion of its population, but by the 1360s trade had resumed, and travelers again described its markets as thriving. Foreign observers, such as Ibn Battuta and European pilgrims, consistently noted Damascus's prosperity and sophistication. Its water system, shaded streets, and abundance of gardens distinguished it from other medieval cities. By the end of the Mamluk period, Damascus remained indispensable. It was a fortified, cultured, and wealthy city that connected Egypt's heartland to the northern frontiers. Every army that sought to dominate the region understood that without Damascus, no empire could claim to rule Syria. By the 15th century, Damascus had matured into a deeply layered city, economically thriving, politically cautious, and intellectually alive. Under the later Mamluks, it became a vital diplomatic and cultural intersection between Egypt, Anatolia, and Persia. Despite constant threats from external powers, its scholarly institutions and administrative efficiency preserved the city's stability and prestige. Damascus functioned as the northern capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a post of both privilege and peril. The governor, Naib al-Sultan, acted not only as Cairo's representative but also as the first line of contact with foreign states. When envoys from the Ottoman beyliks, The AQ Koyunlu Confederation, or the remaining Crusader outposts, sought negotiation. Their caravans first entered Damascus. Embassies were formal affairs. The city's governor received envoys in the Dar al-Sawada, the official palace near the citadel. Protocol dictated that delegations present gifts, horses, textiles, weapons, or rare manuscripts. In return, the Mamluk authorities offered robes of honor, kilay, and detailed hospitality. Behind this ceremony, information was quietly gathered. Officials observed the size of each delegation, the origin of their goods, and the details of their letters. The katibs, scribes, in attendance took meticulous notes, some of which survive in Mamluk administrative manuals that describe proper procedures for receiving foreign envoys. Trade treaties and truce agreements often passed through Damascus before reaching Cairo. The Venetians, who had earlier obtained trading privileges in Egypt, maintained agents in the city to monitor overland routes and political developments. The Ottomans, expanding across Anatolia, also sent observers to gauge the Mamluks' defenses. Damascus was, in effect, the frontier embassy of the Sultanate. The intellectual atmosphere of Damascus in the 14th and 15th centuries was distinguished by prolific scholarship and religious debate. The city's madrasas, endowed through Waqf foundations, produced jurists, historians, and theologians who influenced the broader Islamic world. One of the most notable figures was Ibn Taymiyyah, 1263–1328, whose career reflected the city's intellectual vigor and tension. Though he lived earlier in the Mamluk period, his ideas continued to shape later scholars. Imprisoned several times in Damascus for his reformist views, Ibn Taymiyyah criticized excessive Sufi practices and called for a return to strict scriptural interpretation. His students, such as Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, continued his work, embedding Damascus as a center of theological discourse. In the 15th century, scholars like Ibn Kathir al-Sakawi and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani either studied or lectured in Damascus. Their chronicles provide detailed records of daily life, market prices, famines, court intrigues, and even celestial events. The presence of these historians ensured that almost every significant event in the region was recorded. Damascus's book trade flourished. Its copyists and calligraphers produced Qurans, legal texts, and historical chronicles in exquisite scripts. Paper imported from Samarkand and Tabriz passed through Damascus before being distributed to Cairo and Mecca. The city's libraries, many attached to madrasas, accumulated thousands of manuscripts. Some were later seized or transferred to Istanbul after the Ottoman conquest, forming the core of Ottoman archival collections. Education in Damascus was not limited to the elite. Boys attended Kuttab schools attached to mosques, where they learned to read, write, and memorize the Quran. Higher study took place in the city's many madrasas. The Madrasa al-Adaliyah and Madrasa al-Zahariya were prominent, producing scholars who served as judges, qadis, throughout the Mamluk territories. Public piety was expressed through Waqf endowments. Wealthy merchants and officials donated funds for schools, fountains, and hospices. The Waqf deeds, preserved in legal archives, reveal complex economic systems. Properties in the Ghouta oasis or urban markets generated rent, which financed scholars' stipends and student housing. These documents also show the social hierarchy. Wealthy families perpetuated their names and influence by sponsoring religious institutions, while the poor benefited indirectly through charity and employment. Sufi orders maintained a strong presence. The Rifu'iyya, Qadiriyya, and Naqshbandiyya orders all operated lodges, zawiyas, in the city. Pilgrims en route to Mecca often stayed in these lodges, contributing to the city's cosmopolitan atmosphere. Some Sufi leaders wielded political influence, mediating between citizens and Mamluk officials during crises such as taxation disputes or military levies. Damascus under the Mamluks was divided into distinct social layers. At the top stood the emirs, military commanders, and high officials, who owned large estates in the Ghouta region. They formed the ruling elite, often of Turkic or Circassian origin. Below them were the ulama, scholars, and ayyen, notables, typically from long-established Syrian families. Their prestige came from learning and control of Waqf properties rather than military rank. The merchant class was broad and influential. Many merchants served as intermediaries between local producers and foreign traders. They maintained commercial houses with branches in Aleppo, Cairo, and even Constantinople. Their wealth funded religious and civic architecture, from bathhouses, hammams, to covered markets, souks. Artisans and laborers occupied the next tier, organized through guilds. Each guild maintained internal regulations and mutual aid funds. The weavers, tanners, and metalworkers of Damascus were renowned for their skill and discipline. Below them were the rural peasants, fellahin, who worked in the surrounding Ghouta fields and orchards. Their produce sustained the city, but they remained subject to heavy taxation and corvée labor during public works or military campaigns. Slavery persisted as a social institution, though its form varied. The Mamluk soldiers themselves were technically slaves of the Sultan, manumitted after training. Domestic slaves, primarily from the Caucasus and Africa, served in wealthy households. Legal texts from Damascus describe rules governing their treatment and manumission, indicating the system's codified nature. The economy of Damascus thrived on both local production and international trade. The city exported silk, brocade, and glassware. It imported spices, sugar, and textiles from Egypt and the Indian Ocean. The Souk al-Hamidiyya and Souk al-Zaria were already functioning centers of commerce, lined with shops displaying perfumes, precious stones, and metal goods. Market supervision was strict. The mutasib ensured that no spoiled goods were sold, that bread was properly weighed, and that currency exchange remained stable. Mamluk coins circulated widely, stamped with the Sultan's name and titles. Foreign coins also appeared, particularly Venetian ducats, valued for their gold content. Damascus served as a financial intermediary between the Mediterranean economies and the inland markets of Mesopotamia and Persia. Travelers described the markets as covered with vaulted ceilings pierced by small openings that let in filtered light. The noise of trade blended with the smell of spices and the hammering of craftsmen. Business contracts were often sealed before witnesses in the presence of a qadi, making the economy highly legalistic and traceable. Despite prosperity, Damascus was not immune to turmoil. The later Mamluk period witnessed recurrent disputes between military factions, particularly between Burji, Circassian, and Bari, Turkic elements. The governor of Damascus often found himself navigating rival loyalties between Cairo's court and local emirs. When taxation increased or soldiers went unpaid, riots sometimes erupted in the city's quarters. One of the most significant disturbances occurred in 1389, when competing claimants to the Mamluk throne led to street battles between their supporters. Chronicles mention that merchants shuttered their shops, and the mosque courtyards filled with frightened citizens seeking refuge. Such unrest, though destructive, seldom lasted long. The city's population adapted quickly, returning to business once stability was restored. In the final century of Mamluk rule, the rising Ottoman Empire cast a long shadow over Damascus. Envoys from Sultan Bayezid II and later Selim I were received in the city with caution. The Mamluks sought alliances with local Turkmen rulers to counter the Ottoman advance, but divisions weakened their position. Persian influence, though politically distant, reached Damascus through trade and scholarship. Persian textiles, miniature painting styles, and literature circulated among educated elites. The exchange of ideas across frontiers was constant, though always under the watchful eye of the Mamluk administration, wary of subversion or ideological deviation. The 15th century was marked by repeated outbreaks of plague and by political decline, yet Damascus retained its cultural and spiritual vitality. Pilgrims traveling from Anatolia and Iraq to Mecca stopped in the city to rest and pray at the Umayyad Mosque. The Qibla wall of the mosque was repeatedly repaired and decorated with inscriptions recording donations from successive sultans and governors. The Maqam Yahya, shrine of John the Baptist, within the mosque remained one of the most revered sites, visited by Muslims and Christians alike. Its relic, a head said to belong to the Prophet Yahya, attracted both pilgrims and chroniclers, ensuring Damascus's place in the sacred geography of the region. By the late 1400s, the city had survived invasions, plagues, and dynastic struggles, yet its population and economy endured. It was still regarded as the Pearl of Syria, rich in gardens, scholars, and craft. Its fate, however, would soon change as the Ottoman armies prepared to march southward. By the 12th century, Damascus stood not only as a jewel of commerce but also as a nexus of espionage and diplomacy. Its position between the Crusader states to the west, the Byzantine Empire to the north, and the sprawling Abbasid and Fatimid domains to the east and south made it a crossroads of ambition. Every faction, every ruler, every wandering emissary had something to gain or lose in this city of silk and spies. The Umayyad Mosque remained the silent witness to countless whispers. Inside its vast marble courtyard, men prayed side by side, merchants, scholars, and envoys from distant lands. But among the worshippers were those who observed too much, memorized too keenly, and reported too quietly. A merchant from Aleppo might actually be a courier for the Crusader Knights of Antioch. A pilgrim from Cairo might be gathering intelligence for the Fatimid vizier. A translator working in the caravanserai might be copying letters for a Seljuk emir. Damascus had learned to live with such duplicity. The city did not merely tolerate spies. It absorbed them into its rhythm. The souks offered cover for meetings, the caravan routes disguised secret travel, and the mosaic of ethnic communities, Arab, Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Persian, made infiltration both easy and invisible. The rulers of Damascus, especially under the Burid and later Zengid dynasties, maintained networks of informants that rivaled those of any contemporary empire. Guards at the city gates noted who entered, who left, and what cargo passed through. Market inspectors not only enforced fair prices but also reported seditious conversations. The qadis, judges, and scholars of the madrasas, often funded by rulers, were quietly encouraged to listen for any ideological disloyalty. One of the most remarkable features of medieval Damascus was its diplomatic balancing act. The city's leaders understood that open warfare could destroy trade, and that trade was the lifeblood of Damascus. Hence, the same men who funded raids against Crusader fortresses might also negotiate secret truces with them. Emissaries bearing silks, spices, and fine glassware crossed enemy lines under banners of safe conduct, while their true purpose was to test alliances or to sow misinformation. In this period, the name of Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, began to loom large. Though based elsewhere, his ambitions drew Damascus into a web of shifting loyalties. Zengi's agents operated in the city, courting its commanders and nobles, promising stability under his protection. Meanwhile, the Crusaders of Jerusalem sought to exploit any internal division, dispatching their own envoys disguised as traders or pilgrims. By 1140, Damascus had become the stage for an invisible war. Beneath the clatter of hooves in the bazaars and the murmur of prayers in the mosques, messages passed hand to hand. Coded letters written on parchment as thin as onion skin, rolled into tiny cylinders, and hidden inside the hollow handles of trade goods. Spies met in the hammams, public baths, where the rising steam and murmuring water concealed low voices. In the palatial houses near Bab Sharki, wealthy patrons held gatherings where poets recited verses that carried double meanings. A praise for the moon that watches over Damascus could be a coded reference to a particular leader or military campaign. Skilled listeners understood what others might overlook. The poetry of Damascus was not just art. It was strategy, diplomacy, and sometimes deception. This environment demanded subtlety. Careless word could cost a life. The executioners of the citadel were busy men, for the rulers could not afford leaks of information in a city so entangled in politics. Chronicles tell of envoys imprisoned without explanation, scribes vanishing overnight, and merchants quietly executed in the desert on suspicion of espionage. Yet trade never ceased. The same caravan routes that carried letters of betrayal also carried bolts of Chinese silk and jars of Indian pepper. Damascus's glassmakers continued to shape translucent vessels that reached Venice, while its weavers produced brocades fit for the courts of Baghdad. Even the spies could not resist its allure. Many stayed, seduced by its beauty, its food, its scent of jasmine and almond oil. In a world of uncertainty, Damascus offered both danger and comfort, a paradox that defined its medieval soul. The Mamluks, who would later rule the city, inherited this tradition of espionage and control, but even before their rise, the groundwork had been laid. Every ruler of Damascus learned quickly. To govern here was to listen, and to survive was to trust no one completely. Among the alleys near the Straight Street, rumor spoke of a house of mirrors, a place where letters were intercepted and copied before continuing to their destination. Whether such a place truly existed or was merely legend, the belief itself shaped behavior. Merchants sealed their correspondence in elaborate ways, using wax mixed with perfume to mark authenticity. Couriers swore oaths upon the Quran before departure, though even oaths could be bought. At the heart of this labyrinth was a singular truth: knowledge was as valuable as gold. Damascus thrived not only on the trade of goods but also on the exchange of secrets. Its scholars translated Greek manuscripts, its astronomers charted the heavens, and its spies mapped the shifting loyalties of men. To rule Damascus was to rule a living mind, alert, restless, and always aware of watching eyes. And so, as the 12th century progressed, the city's story deepened. The silk that shimmered in the markets was a metaphor for its political fabric, beautiful, intricate, and easily torn. Each thread was connected to another, and pulling one could unravel the whole. Yet somehow, Damascus endured, poised between empires, surviving by its wit and its ability to listen when others spoke too loudly. By the middle of the 12th century, Damascus stood at the center of a tightening noose. To the west lay the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, hungry for expansion. To the north, the ambitions of Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, who sought to unite Syria under his banner. The city was both a prize and a fortress, a gateway to the Levant, a jewel coveted by every ruler who sought to control the routes of silk and spice. The year 1148 brought the Second Crusade. The city, long accustomed to whispers of espionage, now heard the thunder of hooves and the clash of armor. The Crusaders, led by King Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France, marched upon Damascus. They believed the city vulnerable, for Damascus had once allied itself with the Crusaders against Zengi. But politics in the Middle East were fluid. Yesterday's ally was today's threat. Behind the ancient walls, the people of Damascus prepared for war. The orchards that surrounded the city, green and lush with apricot, pomegranate, and almond trees, were cut down to deny the enemy shelter. The citizens themselves took part in the defense. Chronicles record that even the merchants and craftsmen, men who had never held a sword, carried stones to the battlements. The mosques were filled with prayers, the air thick with smoke and supplication. For 4 tense days, the Crusader armies surrounded Damascus. Their banners fluttered against the horizon, their siege engines assembled beyond the Barada River. Yet the city held firm. The defenders, under the command of Mu'in al-Din Anur, fought with desperate skill. Archers lined the walls, hurling arrows and insults alike. Boiling oil, stones, and firepots rained upon the attackers. The Crusaders found no weakness. But the true strength of Damascus lay not only in its walls but in its diplomacy. Even as arrows flew, envoys were sent secretly to Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Aleppo, offering allegiance in exchange for aid. The city's leaders calculated that aligning with the powerful Muslim prince was less dangerous than falling to the Crusaders. And so, in the midst of siege, a new alliance was born. The Crusaders, plagued by indecision and betrayal, withdrew after only 4 days. The gardens they had hoped to claim as their prize lay ruined. The city they had sought to conquer remained unconquered. Their failure marked the turning point of the Second Crusade, and Damascus emerged stronger than before, but bound now to Nur ad-Din. Under Nur ad-Din's rule, Damascus entered a period of disciplined governance and renewed purpose. The city's mosques echoed not with intrigue but with sermons of unity. Nur ad-Din, austere and pious, built madrasas and hospitals, encouraging scholarship and moral reform. His rule brought order to a city long divided by self-interest. Yet even in this new age, espionage remained a part of daily life. Only now it served a different master. The Beit al-Mal, the treasury of Damascus, became a center of strategic planning. Intelligence from across Syria flowed into the city. Reports from Aleppo, Homs, and the Crusader frontiers. Spies infiltrated the fortresses of the Franks, learning of their garrisons and supplies. In return, Nur ad-Din's scribes sent forged messages and false envoys to sow confusion among his enemies. It was during this time that the foundations were laid for a greater struggle, the jihad against the Crusaders that would later be led by Salah ad-Din or Saladin. The young general, once in Nur ad-Din's service, learned in Damascus the arts of patience, secrecy, and strategy. The city's scholars and jurists, gathered in the shade of the Umayyad mosque, debated theology by day and politics by night. They spoke of divine justice, of unity under Islam, and of reclaiming Jerusalem. Trade continued as always. The Suq al-Hamidiyya thrived even in wartime. Caravans from the east brought silks, sugar and glassware. Merchants from Venice and Genoa, despite the conflicts, still found ways to deal through intermediaries. Damascus could not afford isolation. It was too deeply tied to the arteries of the medieval world. Yet beneath this flow of commerce, the machinery of intelligence turned ceaselessly. Letters from Cairo to Damascus were intercepted and read. Messengers who crossed the desert were questioned, sometimes tortured, for hidden meanings. Diplomacy and deceit were twin instruments of survival. When Nur ad-Din fell ill in 1174, the city once again stood at a crossroads. He had forged an empire from northern Syria to Egypt's doorstep, but his death left a vacuum. Damascus, ever pragmatic, prepared for another shift in loyalty. The man who would fill that void, Saladin, was already moving swiftly. Saladin entered Damascus in triumph that same year. His rise was greeted with both relief and caution. To the citizens, he represented strength and continuity. To the merchants, he promised stability for trade. To the scholars, he was a symbol of unity against the Crusaders. Under his rule, Damascus would once again become the beating heart of the Muslim world. But for the moment, in those final days of Nur ad-Din's reign, the people of Damascus stood on their balconies and rooftops, watching the dust of distant armies. They had seen kings come and go, alliances rise and fall. Their city had survived the siege, the spies, and the shifting loyalties of empires. The Barada River still flowed through its gardens, carrying with it the whispers of history. The alleys smelled of jasmine again, and the call to prayer echoed from the Umayyad mosque. The people returned to their lives. Merchants reopened their stalls, glassblowers stoked their furnaces, scribes resumed their work. The siege had passed, but the vigilance remained. Damascus had learned its lesson well. Power was fleeting, but knowledge endured. In the years to come, that lesson would shape its destiny under Saladin, when once again the city would stand between faith and conquest, between trade and war, between secrecy and survival. When Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin, entered Damascus in 1174, he did not come as a conqueror but as a restorer. The people had already whispered his name for years, an honorable general under Nur ad-Din, a man of discipline, faith, and calculated mercy. The city that had endured betrayal and siege greeted him with cautious reverence. Banners of green and gold fluttered above the gates. The scent of musk filled the streets. Saladin understood Damascus in a way few rulers ever had. He saw it not merely as a city but as a living organism. Its veins were trade routes, its heart the great Umayyad mosque, and its breath the voices of scholars and merchants. From the first days of his rule, he treated the city as both sanctuary and command center. He knew that to reclaim Jerusalem, he first needed the steady pulse of Damascus behind him. The new ruler began by consolidating authority. Nur ad-Din's loyalists still held influence, and Saladin moved carefully, appointing his own men without bloodshed. The people admired his restraint. Chroniclers such as Ibn al-Athir wrote of how Saladin avoided unnecessary executions, preferring persuasion over fear. In the labyrinthine streets near Bab al-Jabiyah, spies once employed by rival factions now found themselves summoned to serve a new master. Saladin did not abolish the city's intelligence network. He refined it. Under his direction, the city's Diwan al-Razail, the Bureau of Correspondence, expanded. Every letter from the provinces was examined. Every rumor weighed. The same couriers who carried diplomatic letters also bore secret messages written in invisible ink or encoded with poetic metaphors only trusted scribes could decipher. The art of espionage, already mature under the Burids and Zengids, reached a new sophistication under the Ayyubids. Yet Saladin was more than a spy master. He was a visionary statesman. Damascus under his rule became a city of preparation and prayer. Workshops produced armor and weapons for the coming jihad. The blacksmith's fires burned day and night, their hammer strikes echoing through the alleys like the heartbeat of war. At the same time, mosques and madrasas multiplied. The Madrasa al-Nuriyah, founded by Nur ad-Din, now hosted scholars who preached unity and discipline. In the courtyards of the Umayyad Mosque, theologians debated law, faith, and ethics while Saladin's soldiers trained in the fields beyond the walls. The ruler's blending of faith and governance gave the city a rare harmony. Even his critics, some of whom resented his Kurdish origins, admitted that Damascus had not known such stability in decades. Trade never faltered. Venetian and Genoese merchants, pragmatic as always, negotiated permission to continue commerce through neutral intermediaries. Silk from Persia, ivory from Africa, and sugar from the Jordan Valley filled the markets. Damascus's artisans grew famous across the Mediterranean. Its steel blades, patterned and sharp, became prized possessions of both Muslim and Crusader knights. Within the city walls, Saladin maintained a quiet vigilance. He had learned from the past that the greatest dangers were not always external. Espionage and counter-espionage continued to weave their silent threads. Informants reported on tax officials, scholars, and even military officers. Letters from Cairo and Aleppo were scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Yet there was no climate of terror. Saladin's intelligence system was precise, not paranoid. He also invested in the city's spirit. The hospitals, by Maristans, of Damascus became models of care and organization. Physicians trained there treated the sick without charge, their methods rooted in the legacy of Avicenna and al-Razi. One of these institutions, the Bimaristan al-Nuri, continued to operate for centuries afterward. Its marble halls, perfumed with vinegar and herbs, echoed with the murmur of scholars reading medical treatises. In 1187, when Saladin's armies triumphed at Hattin and reclaimed Jerusalem, the celebrations in Damascus were unlike any seen before. The mosques overflowed with people. Candles lit the streets from Bab Toma to Bab al-Faraj. Chroniclers describe merchants closing their shops to join the prayers of thanksgiving. The victory had been won through strategy, patience, and faith, the same virtues that had rebuilt Damascus itself. After Hattin, the city became the administrative heart of Saladin's empire. Ambassadors arrived from Sicily, Byzantium, and even the Crusader states to negotiate truces. The courtyards of Damascus hosted men of every tongue: Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Franks. Its scribes produced treaties in elegant Arabic calligraphy, sealed with green wax and perfumed oils. Behind these formalities, the intelligence officers of the Ayyubid court listened carefully, noting every accent, every hesitation. Yet even as it rose in power, Damascus never lost its humility. Saladin himself lived simply, refusing luxury. He gave away most of his wealth in charity, and when he died in 1193, his possessions amounted to little more than a few coins and a sword. His funeral procession through Damascus was marked not by royal grandeur but by solemn devotion. Crowds lined the streets, weeping openly as his coffin passed beneath the shadow of the Umayyad Mosque. The chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad wrote that the city seemed to hold its breath that day. The ruler who had united Egypt and Syria, who had humbled kings and reclaimed Jerusalem, was gone. Yet his legacy was woven into Damascus itself. The institutions he built, the tolerance he encouraged, and the vigilance he maintained would guide the city for generations. In the years following his death, Damascus remained the capital of the Ayyubid dynasty. The sons and brothers of Saladin ruled in shifting harmony and rivalry, but the foundations he had laid, strong administration, disciplined intelligence, and respect for learning, endured. Travelers from as far as Andalusia and India continued to call it the Pearl of the East. From its terraces one could still see the orchards glistening under the Syrian sun, the Barada River threading through fields of green. The call to prayer still rose over the rooftops, mingling with the hammering of artisans and the cries of traders. The spies still listened, the scribes still wrote, and the city continued to dream. Damascus had survived another transformation, once again proving that its strength was not only in its walls or armies but in its capacity to adapt, to endure, and to watch the tides of history flow past without ever drowning. After the death of Saladin in 1193, Damascus entered a new and uncertain chapter. The city had been the beating heart of his empire, but with his passing came the inevitable question of succession. His sons and brothers divided the vast Ayyubid realm among themselves, each seeking to preserve his share of power. Damascus, the jewel of Syria, became both prize and battleground in the family's shifting rivalries. In the years that followed, the city saw a succession of rulers, Al-Afdal, Al-Adil, Al-Kamil, and others, each attempting to assert control over the fragmented dominions of the late Sultan. The sons of Saladin, though heirs to a great legacy, could not match his vision. Yet Damascus remained what it had always been, a city of intellect, trade, and intrigue, able to endure the ambitions of men. The Umayyad Mosque still stood at the center of public life. Its marble floors echoed with the sandals of scholars and the voices of Quran reciters. But behind its serenity, Damascus became a chessboard of diplomacy. The Crusader states still held the coast, the Abbasids ruled nominally in Baghdad, and new powers were rising in the east. The rulers of Damascus found themselves balancing loyalty, faith, and survival. The Ayyubid princes of Damascus often acted independently of their kin in Cairo or Aleppo. Their court became a place where envoys from across the Levant negotiated treaties, truces, and trade. Venetian merchants brought glassware and coral. Egyptian officials brought papyrus and news of the Nile's floods. The city's scribes were always busy, recording decrees, drafting alliances, and sometimes fabricating letters meant to mislead foreign powers. The Ayyubid rulers invested in architecture and education. New madrasas, mosques, and mausoleums rose beside the ancient Roman walls. The Madrasa al-Azaziyah and Madrasa al-Adaliyah, named for Saladin's descendants, became centers of jurisprudence and theology. These institutions preserved not only knowledge but also authority. Their scholars often served as mediators between rival princes. Trade remained Damascus's lifeblood. The Suq al-Hamidiyya and its surrounding markets thrived with silk, spices, and damask cloth. Artisans crafted metalwork inlaid with silver and gold, their patterns intricate and mathematical. Damascus blades, sharp, resilient, and elegantly patterned, were carried by warriors from Cairo to Delhi. The city's reputation for fine craftsmanship became legendary. But peace was fragile. The Crusaders continued to raid inland territories, while the Ayyubid princes quarreled among themselves. Damascus occasionally allied with Crusader rulers out of expediency, then turned against them when fortunes changed. Espionage flourished in this climate of shifting loyalties. Spies reported not only on enemies but on brothers, cousins, and viziers. The courtyards of Damascus were filled with watchful eyes. One of the city's most enduring qualities was its ability to adapt to power. When Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt signed a treaty with Emperor Frederick II in 1229, temporarily granting Jerusalem to the Crusaders, Damascus observed in silence. The city's merchants continued trading, its scholars continued teaching. It had survived Mongols, Crusaders, and dynastic feuds before, it would survive them again. Still, the 13th century brought a new and terrifying force from the east: the Mongols. Word of their conquests spread through caravans long before their horsemen reached the Levant. The stories were unbelievable. Entire cities leveled, rivers running red with blood, libraries burned to ash. Damascus listened with dread. Before the Mongol threat arrived, however, another transformation was already underway. In Egypt, the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of Turkic and Circassian origin, had begun to rise in power. Trained from childhood in warfare and loyalty, they were both feared and respected. When they overthrew the last Ayyubid sultan in Cairo in 1250, Damascus found itself looking south once again, wondering which ruler to acknowledge. The Ayyubid prince of Damascus, Al-Nasir Yusuf, attempted to hold the city's independence. He fortified the citadel, gathered troops, and maintained an uneasy diplomacy with both the Mongols and the Mamluks. For a few years, Damascus remained a buffer state, too important to destroy, too proud to surrender. But history had already chosen its course. In 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad, ending the Abbasid Caliphate. The shock reverberated through the Islamic world. Refugees flooded into Damascus, scholars, artisans, and survivors of the destruction. The city swelled with grief and fear. The Barada River carried not just water but stories of catastrophe. 2 years later, in 1260, the Mongols reached Syria. They captured Aleppo and marched toward Damascus. The people trembled as the dust of the eastern armies darkened the sky. Al-Nasir Yusuf fled, abandoning the city to its fate. When the Mongol general Kitbuka entered Damascus, there was no resistance. Yet, unlike Baghdad, the city was spared total annihilation. The Mongols, recognizing its beauty and strategic value, occupied it but left much intact. Chroniclers record that for several months, the streets were silent, the markets closed, the mosques half empty. The spies and merchants who once thrived in secrecy now hid in their own homes. Damascus was alive but subdued, waiting for deliverance. That deliverance came swiftly. In the same year, the Mamluk general Baybars and his master, Sultan Qutuz, marched north from Egypt to confront the Mongols. On the fields near Ain Jalut, they achieved one of the most decisive victories in medieval history. The Mongol advance was broken. Tide turned. News of the victory reached Damascus within days. Bells rang, prayers filled the mosques, and cautious joy spread through the weary streets. When Baybars entered the city, he was greeted as a savior. The banners of the Mamluks replaced those of the Mongols. For the first time, Egypt and Syria were united under a new power, one born not of royal blood but of discipline, merit, and sword. Damascus, as it had so many times before, adapted to the change. The people reopened their shops, the scholars returned to their lectures, and the spies began once again to whisper in the corners of the Suk. The Mamluks, recognizing the city's value, made it one of their chief capitals. The story of Damascus, from the silk of its markets to the shadows of its intrigue, would continue, now under the banners of men who had once been slaves. The transition from Ayyubid to Mamluk rule was more than political. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, a transformation in which Damascus, once again, found a way to survive between empires, faiths, and the ambitions of men. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Damascus had become one of the most sophisticated intellectual centers in the Islamic world, a city where the pursuit of knowledge was treated not merely as an act of scholarship, but as a sacred duty. The sound of scribes scratching ink across parchment echoed through the courtyards of madrasas, while translators debated philosophy under the arches of marble halls. The Umayyad Mosque, still central to the city's life, was not just a site of prayer but also a place of instruction. Scholars gathered under its vast domes to teach students Quranic studies, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Damascus was known for its open exchange of knowledge. Foreign travelers, whether from Persia, Byzantium, or the far western lands, found welcome among its intellectuals. One of the most celebrated institutions was the Madrasa al-Nuriyah, established by Nur ad-Din Zangi in the mid-12th century. It symbolized the ruler's belief that the strength of the Muslim world depended on both faith and intellect. The madrasa's library contained hundreds of volumes, carefully copied, illuminated, and bound by hand. Students from Aleppo, Cairo, and even distant Nishapur came to study under renowned scholars who specialized in everything from logic to linguistics. Damascus's scholars were also practical men. They applied mathematics to architecture, optics to irrigation, and astronomy to navigation. The city's muwakkits, timekeepers, stood on minarets to observe the stars and calculate the precise moments for prayer. Their measurements, recorded with meticulous care, helped refine instruments later adopted by European astronomers. In the heart of the city, near the eastern markets, the Beit al-Hikmah al-Dimashqiyya, the House of Wisdom of Damascus, was a quiet fortress of learning. Inspired by Baghdad's earlier model, it became a center for translation. Greek works by Aristotle and Galen, Persian treatises on medicine, and Sanskrit writings on mathematics were translated into Arabic. Scholars such as Ibn al-Nafis, who later described the pulmonary circulation of blood, were trained in these scholarly circles. His discoveries would influence medical understanding centuries later in Europe. Scribes sat cross-legged at low tables, copying manuscripts by the light of oil lamps. The process was slow and deliberate. Ink made from gall nuts and soot stained their fingertips as they worked in silence. Each copy was more than a reproduction. It was a form of devotion. Through their work, Damascus became a bridge through which the wisdom of ancient civilizations flowed into the modern world. The intellectual life of Damascus also reflected its cosmopolitan nature. Jews, Christians, and Muslims often worked together on translation projects. In private libraries owned by wealthy patrons, collections of texts in Arabic, Greek, Syriac, and Hebrew were stored side by side. Scholars engaged in dialogue that crossed faiths, united by curiosity and mutual respect. The atmosphere of learning influenced every corner of society. Physicians studied at hospitals like the Bimaristan Al-Nuri, where medical students practiced on patients under supervision. Pharmacists sold herbal remedies and ointments crafted from recipes written centuries earlier by Persian doctors. Calligraphers perfected their art in the margins of scholarly texts, transforming words into beauty. Even travelers were drawn to the city's learning. The Andalusian scholar Ibn Jubair, who visited Damascus in 1184, wrote that the city holds a preeminence in science, virtue, and beauty that none may deny. He described its madrasas as gardens of knowledge, and its scholars as the guardians of reason and revelation alike. But beneath this tranquil surface of scholarship ran a deeper current of tension. Knowledge was power, and rulers knew it. The libraries and schools were not only places of learning but also instruments of control. Political elites funded scholars whose writings supported their authority, while others, more independent thinkers, risked exile or imprisonment for challenging orthodox interpretations. Still, the legacy of these centuries would endure. The manuscripts copied in Damascus found their way to Cairo, Cordoba, and beyond, shaping the course of intellectual history. And though the city's fortunes would later rise and fall, its reputation as a cradle of learning would never fade. In the soft light of dawn, when the muezzin's call echoed across the rooftops, students gathered once more in the courtyards of their madrasas. They unrolled their scrolls, whispered their lessons, and continued the work of generations, guardians of knowledge in the city of silk and spies. By the late 12th century, the balance of power in the Levant had shifted once again. The Crusaders held coastal strongholds along the Mediterranean, but inland, Damascus stood defiant, a bastion of Muslim strength under the rule of the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by the great commander al-Ad-Din al-Ayyubi, known in the West as Saladin. When Saladin entered Damascus in 1174, the city was weary from decades of rivalry between local rulers and foreign incursions. Yet beneath the tension, its walls still gleamed, its gardens still flourished, and its merchants still traded as they always had. To the people, his arrival was both a promise and a test. A new ruler who vowed to restore unity, faith, and justice. The city soon became one of Saladin's favored residences. From his palace near the citadel of Damascus, he governed a vast realm that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The streets outside the fortress buzzed with activity, blacksmiths forging armor, traders selling provisions for the armies, and scholars debating the laws of jihad and governance. Under Saladin, Damascus became not just a military center but a moral one. The Ayyubid rulers built madrasas, hospitals, and religious endowments known as waqf. Wealth from Egypt and the conquered Crusader states flowed into the city, funding the restoration of mosques and markets. The Madrasa al-Salahiyya, founded in honor of Saladin's father, became one of the most respected centers of Shafi'i legal learning. Yet the city was not untouched by war. The call to arms reverberated through its mosques as armies prepared for campaigns against the Crusaders. The clang of swords mixed with the chanting of imams. Caravanserais filled with soldiers, horses, and provisions. Behind the city walls, armorers hammered steel, arrow makers strung bows, and clerks tallied the supplies that would feed thousands of men marching to battle. In 1187, when news reached Damascus that Saladin had recaptured Jerusalem after nearly 90 years of Crusader control, the city erupted in jubilation. Mosques overflowed with worshippers giving thanks. Poets composed verses comparing the victory to a sunrise after endless night. Traders, ever pragmatic, saw opportunity in the reopening of routes once blocked by war. But victory brought new burdens. Saladin's administration had to maintain control over a diverse empire while preserving the fragile unity of its people. Damascus became the heart of that effort, a place where diplomacy and espionage intertwined. Messengers carried secret letters to Cairo, Aleppo, and Baghdad. Some never returned. Foreign envoys came in disguise, posing as merchants or pilgrims. Within the city's walls, spies from every camp sought advantage in the shadow of minarets. Life for ordinary citizens continued in this uneasy balance between war and peace. Women drew water from the Barada River, unaware that soldiers practiced sword drills nearby. Children played in the courtyards of caravanserais where foreign travelers whispered in languages they could not understand. In the spice markets, men haggled over saffron and cinnamon even as rumors of Crusader movements reached their ears. Saladin himself, though a warrior, preferred diplomacy. Chroniclers describe him walking through Damascus in simple robes, visiting scholars and listening to grievances. He rebuilt the citadel, strengthening its towers and walls, but he also endowed hospitals like the Bimaristan Al-Nuri, ensuring that soldiers and civilians alike received care. After Saladin's death in 1193, his body was laid to rest beside the Umayyad mosque. His tomb, modest and unadorned, became a place of quiet reverence. Pilgrims from distant lands visited it, whispering prayers for the leader who had united them. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded endured for decades after him. His sons and brothers ruled from Cairo and Damascus, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals. Each contributed to the city's transformation. Palaces rose, gardens expanded, and schools multiplied. Yet with each succession came new intrigues. Spies loyal to one prince shadowing the agents of another, secret oaths sworn in candlelit rooms, and assassins sent under the cover of night. Through it all, Damascus remained the jewel of the Levant. Its merchants grew rich from trade with the East and West, its scholars kept the light of learning alive, and its people learned to live with the knowledge that peace was always temporary. By the dawn of the 13th century, as Europe began to stir with renewed crusading fervor, Damascus stood at the crossroads of history once more. A city of faith and fear, knowledge and secrecy, silk and spies. The early 13th century brought a new kind of storm to Damascus, not of faith, but of fire and iron. From the far steppes of Asia, an unstoppable force began to move westward. The Mongols. Kingdom after kingdom fell beneath their advance, their cities burned, and their rulers executed. Word of their brutal efficiency traveled ahead of them, whispered in marketplaces and courts alike. In 1258, when Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, was destroyed by Hulagu Khan's army, A chill fell over the Islamic world. The libraries of Baghdad, once filled with the works of scholars and poets, were thrown into the Tigris River, staining its waters black with ink. When the news reached Damascus, its people trembled. The city, proud and ancient, suddenly seemed fragile. In the years that followed, Damascus prepared for the unthinkable. Its walls were repaired, and its gates fortified. Merchants began hiding their gold, scholars their manuscripts. The calligraphers and artisans who had once worked on decorative tiles now turned to crafting armor and shields. Caravan routes grew dangerous as Mongol scouts approached the Euphrates. In 1260, the Mongol army, led by Kitbuka, entered Syria. Aleppo was the first to fall, its mosques looted, its inhabitants slain. Refugees poured south toward Damascus, bringing tales of horror. Cities in ashes, children enslaved, and the Mongol banners flying over conquered lands. The people of Damascus waited in fear, knowing their turn would come. When the Mongols reached the outskirts of the city, resistance seemed futile. Damascus surrendered without a fight, opening its gates to avoid the fate of Aleppo. Kitbuka entered the city in triumph. Chroniclers describe him riding through the eastern gate, his horse stepping over the petals scattered by trembling citizens. The Mongols imposed order swiftly, executions for defiance, tribute for obedience. For several months, Damascus endured the occupation. The Mongols established quarters in the palaces once belonging to Ayyubid princes. They seized wealth from merchants and took what they wished. But their rule would not last. In the same year, the tide began to turn. From the south came a new power, the Mamluks of Egypt, led by Sultan Saif ad-Din Qutuz and his general Baybars. At Ain Jalut, in the plains of Palestine, the Mamluks met the Mongols in battle. Against all odds they triumphed. Kitbuka was captured and executed, and the Mongol advance was halted, the first great defeat the Mongols had suffered in the Islamic world. The victory at Ain Jalut echoed across the region like thunder. Damascus, hearing the news, erupted in celebration. The Mongol garrisons fled, leaving behind ashes and silence. When the Mamluk army entered Damascus soon after, they were greeted as liberators. Baybars, fierce and cunning, quickly established control. The people, though weary of new rulers, were grateful for peace. Under Mamluk rule, the city began to recover. The mosques were repaired, trade routes reopened, and scholars returned to their schools. Yet the memory of fire and fear lingered. Baybars understood the importance of Damascus, not only as a military outpost but as a symbol of legitimacy. He made the city a secondary capital of his realm, building new fortifications, restoring the citadel, and strengthening the Umayyad mosque. He also established a network of intelligence, spies, informants, and secret agents who operated across the Levant. From Cairo to Aleppo, the Mamluks relied on information as much as on swords. The Mongols, though defeated, remained a constant threat. Over the next decades, their armies returned again and again. Each invasion brought new devastation, but Damascus endured. Its walls were rebuilt, its gardens replanted, its people unbroken. Chroniclers like Ibn Wasil and Abu Shama recorded these years of turmoil, the endless cycle of destruction and renewal that defined medieval Syria. Within the city, life adjusted to the rhythm of uncertainty. The markets reopened though prices soared. Silk weavers returned to their looms, producing fine brocades once again for Cairo and beyond. Scholars resumed their lectures, some writing commentaries on Aristotle, while others recorded the events that had scarred their homeland. The Mamluks, though military rulers, were patrons of culture. They funded madrasas, hospitals, and konkas, Sufi lodges where mystics gathered in prayer. Damascus became a city of both discipline and devotion, its air filled with the mingled sounds of hammers, prayers, and recitations. But the legacy of espionage deepened under the Mamluks. The rulers maintained spies in every province, to track enemies, monitor rivals, and suppress rebellion. Even in Damascus, whispers of informants filled the air. Letters were intercepted, conversations overheard, and merchants questioned. For many, trust became a luxury. And yet, beneath the shadow of politics and war, the soul of the city endured. The Barada River still flowed through its gardens. Children still played among the fig trees. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind Mount Kazan, the muezzin's call rose once more, ancient, unbroken, and filled with faith. By the late 13th and into the 14th century, Damascus had emerged as one of the jewels of the Mamluk Sultanate, a city both fortified by war and softened by art. The Mongol threat still lingered at the edges of the empire, but within the city walls, life began to bloom once again. The Mamluks, though born as slave soldiers, had become builders of a thriving civilization. Under their rule, Damascus became a hub of art, architecture, and trade unmatched in the eastern Mediterranean. The skyline of Damascus changed. Minarets rose higher, crowned with muqarnas, intricate stonework resembling stalactites. The citadel, rebuilt and expanded, became a symbol of Mamluk authority. New madrasas, hospices, and baths appeared throughout the city, many adorned with marble mosaics and inscriptions in elegant Thuluth script. Streets once scarred by invasion now echoed with the rhythmic hammering of craftsmen, the splash of fountains, and the murmur of merchants. The Mamluks understood the value of beauty as a form of power. Each ruler left behind monuments to his name. Kalawan, Nasir Muhammad, Barkak, their legacies carved into the very fabric of Damascus. The Madrasa al-Adaliyah, Konka Barsia, and Bimaristan al-Kalawan were not merely buildings but declarations of wealth, faith, and endurance. The city's artisans reached new heights during this period. Damascus was famous across continents for its textiles, particularly its fine silk brocades and patterned damask cloths, fabrics so exquisite that even European nobles prized them. The word damask itself became synonymous with luxury. The weaving looms of the city produced shimmering fabrics that carried the designs of Islamic geometry and floral motifs to faraway lands. Metal workers of Damascus were equally renowned. They created inlaid brass bowls and candlesticks decorated with silver and gold, inscribed with verses from the Quran or the names of patrons. These works traveled to Cairo, Istanbul, Venice, and beyond, traded along the routes that connected the Islamic world with Europe and Asia. In the souks, life never ceased. The Al-Hamidiyya Bazaar, ancestor of today's markets, was a maze of narrow lanes filled with scents of musk, coffee, leather, and frankincense. Foreign merchants from Genoa, Venice, and even as far as India came to bargain. Spices from Malabar, porcelain from China, and furs from Central Asia all passed through Damascus before continuing toward the Mediterranean. This trade brought not only wealth but also diplomacy. The Mamluks maintained embassies with European powers, especially with the Republic of Venice, to secure trade rights. In these delicate negotiations, Damascus often served as the stage. Envoys met in richly decorated halls, surrounded by translators, scribes, and soldiers. They exchanged silks, glassware, and horses for European wool, silver, and weaponry. Behind every treaty, however, lurked the quiet presence of spies. Every merchant was a potential informant, every traveler a possible agent. The Mamluk intelligence network stretched from Damascus to Cairo and beyond. Letters written in coded phrases passed through caravan routes. Invisible ink and hidden compartments became tools of diplomacy. Espionage was an accepted part of survival in an age where knowledge was more valuable than gold. Despite this undercurrent of secrecy, Damascus became a sanctuary for scholars, poets, and mystics. The city's Sufi orders flourished, especially the Qadiriyya and Naqshbandiyya. In the evenings, the sound of dhikr, rhythmic chanting and remembrance of God, filled the air from konkas nestled among the gardens. Travelers wrote of the serenity of these gatherings, where men in white robes swayed in circles under the flicker of oil lamps. The renowned traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Damascus in the 14th century, wrote in awe, "There is no city in the world that surpasses Damascus in the beauty of its buildings, the abundance of its trees, the sweetness of its waters, and the fertility of its lands." He described the bustling colleges, the generosity of the people, and the endless flow of scholars debating in the shade of courtyards. To Ibn Battuta, Damascus was both a paradise and a university, a place where the worldly and the spiritual met in perfect harmony. Education thrived under the Mamluks. Each madrasa specialized in a particular field: Quranic recitation, law, grammar, or medicine. Wealthy patrons funded scholarships, and students from as far as North Africa and Persia came to study. The Umayyad Mosque, the heart of Damascus, continued to serve as both a religious and intellectual gathering place. But beyond the beauty, cracks began to appear. The Mamluk state, heavily dependent on military strength and taxation, faced corruption and internal strife. Power shifted rapidly between sultans, each supported by factions of emirs. The people of Damascus had grown accustomed to seeing processions of new rulers entering the city gates, greeted by banners one month and replaced by another the next. Still, the pulse of the city continued. The Barada River irrigated its orchards, caravans arrived daily, and the artisans' workshops remained alive with sound. Even as political intrigues unfolded in secret chambers, the outward life of Damascus, graceful, vibrant, and industrious, carried on as if untouched by the struggles of the elite. By the dawn of the 15th century, Damascus had become a city that embodied the contradictions of its age. Beauty born from violence, stability resting on espionage, and faith intertwined with politics. It was, as one traveler called it, a city of silk and spies, where the whisper of a secret is worth more than a caravan of gold. By the early 15th century, Damascus remained outwardly magnificent, its mosques alive with recitation, its bazaars crowded, its artisans still weaving silk that shimmered like the wings of a moth. But beneath the beauty, the city trembled with unease. The long centuries of Mamluk rule had brought both prosperity and exhaustion. The same iron discipline that had once built an empire now began to corrode it from within. The Mamluk Sultanate, though rich in culture and trade, had no clear system of inheritance. Every new sultan had to secure power through intrigue, alliances, and blood. Damascus, as the empire's northern capital, became a theater of endless maneuvering. Emirs stationed in the citadel plotted against rivals in Cairo. Letters bearing false seals were sent in the night. Oaths of loyalty were made and broken under the same stars. The people of Damascus had grown accustomed to instability. A new governor might arrive in splendid procession one week, only to be executed or exiled the next. Soldiers paraded through the streets to display their allegiance, while spies lingered in mosques and markets, listening for dissent. Informants were everywhere, among merchants, scholars, even within families. The Mamluks' taxation grew heavier as the state sought to finance its armies and fortresses. Wealthy merchants were forced to pay gifts to local emirs. The common people, farmers, weavers, and artisans, bore the brunt of this burden. Yet they continued to labor, sustained by faith and habit. The souks still bustled, the bakers' ovens still glowed, and on Fridays, the call to prayer rose over the city, the same as it had for centuries. Nature, however, was less forgiving. In 1400, a new terror swept across Syria, not from the west, but from the east once more. The conqueror Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, marched with his armies toward Damascus. His banners bore the crescent and the sword, and his reputation for destruction preceded him. When Timur's forces reached Aleppo, they crushed its defenders and set the city aflame. Refugees again streamed into Damascus, haunted by memories of the Mongols a century earlier. The Mamluk governor of the city, Sudar, attempted to fortify the walls and prepare for siege, but panic had already spread. In 1401, Timur's army surrounded Damascus. Negotiations failed. For 6 days, his troops stormed the defenses, burning and looting. The city fell. Chroniclers such as Ibn Taghraberdi and Ibn Khaldun, the latter present in Timur's camp, recorded the devastation. The great Umayyad Mosque, jewel of the Islamic world, was set ablaze. Its gilded mosaics melted in the heat, its minarets blackened. Thousands were slain or enslaved. The once gleaming city of jasmine became a field of ashes. After Timur withdrew, taking craftsmen and scholars east to Samarkand, Damascus began once again the long process of rebuilding. The scars of the fire remained for decades, but the spirit of the city endured. Its people replanted gardens, restored homes, and rebuilt the mosque stone by stone. The Barada River still flowed, carrying life through the ruins. The later 15th century saw a slow return to stability under the re-established Mamluk order, though it was weaker than before. Trade resumed along the old routes. Caravans once more carried silk, spices, and glass through the city. Pilgrims to Mecca continued to stop in Damascus, resting beneath its palm trees and praising its hospitality. The Hajj caravans, guarded by Mamluk soldiers, were among the most organized of their time. The city became the main staging point for pilgrims from across the empire, a role that reinforced its spiritual prestige. Still, beneath the surface, decline deepened. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Soldiers grew undisciplined, and emirs fought among themselves for power and wealth. The Ottoman Turks, rising in Anatolia, began to cast their gaze toward Syria. They watched Damascus carefully, a city too valuable to ignore. By the early 16th century, as the Mamluks clashed with the expanding Ottomans, Damascus stood once again at a crossroads of empires. The people whispered of a new conqueror from the north, Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim. In 1516, his armies met the Mamluks at Marj Dabik, near Aleppo. The Mamluks were crushed. Their sultan, Kansa al-Ghori, was slain. The road to Damascus lay open. When the Ottoman army entered the city, there was little resistance. The gates opened, and Selim rode in under banners of crimson and gold. He prayed at the Umayyad Mosque, visited the tomb of Saladin, and declared that Damascus would remain a jewel of his new empire. For the citizens, it was another chapter in a long story. A change of flags, a new master, but the same enduring city. The Ottomans imposed order swiftly. They re-established the courts, reopened the markets, and began to rebuild what war had once again destroyed. Damascus became a provincial capital within the Ottoman world, connected now to Istanbul by both politics and trade. The Mamluks faded into history, but their legacy lingered in the architecture, the schools, and the memories of their rule. Damascus had survived the Mongols, the Crusaders, Tamerlane, and centuries of intrigue. It had endured the rise and fall of dynasties, yet it remained, as always, a city of contrasts, of scholars and soldiers, merchants and spies, beauty and fear. The medieval age was ending, and a new world was rising. But as dawn broke over the old stone walls, the people of Damascus went about their day, as they always had, unaware that they lived in one of history's most remarkable cities, the eternal city of silk and spies. By the late 13th century, Damascus had become more than a trade hub. It was a living archive of centuries of conquest, diplomacy, and subtle intrigue. Every dynasty that held it left behind not only monuments of stone but also layers of political habits, the art of negotiation, and the methods of silent observation. The city's bazaars, palaces, and mosques had seen it all. Crusaders, Mongols, Mamluks, and merchants from Venice to Delhi. But amid this constant exchange of goods and ideas, another trade flourished quietly, the exchange of secrets. The merchants of Damascus were not only traders of silk, spices, and jewels, they were also carriers of news. A Venetian trader might bring not just coral from the Adriatic, but whispers of alliances forming between kings. A caravan from Cairo might carry word of military movements along the Red Sea. Damascus became a center for gathering, filtering, and passing on information. Its people, from caravan masters to coffee sellers, learned the value of silence and the danger of loose words. The Mamluk rulers of Egypt and Syria recognized the city's strategic importance. To them, Damascus was a shield. Its mountains provided natural defenses, its markets financed armies, and its people could sense danger before it reached Cairo. The city's governor maintained an elaborate network of informants. Scribes in the posthouses who read letters before sealing them again, stablemen who counted horses in passing caravans, and scholars who overheard conversations between foreign diplomats in the madrasas. In the Umayyad Mosque's vast courtyard, travelers from far lands knelt side by side, murmuring prayers beneath mosaics of gold and green. But beyond the sanctity of the place, there was often a silent observation. Men of letters noted accents, clothing, and the symbols engraved on the hilts of swords. The line between piety and politics was thin. The same men who debated theology by day might meet in secret by night, exchanging intelligence for patronage or coin. The Mongol invasions in the mid-13th century had shown how fragile the world of Damascus could be. When Hulagu's forces swept across the Middle East, the city trembled, its people torn between resistance and survival. Some chronicles speak of Damascus surrendering to avoid destruction, a pragmatic choice, preserving life and architecture at the cost of pride. After the Mongols withdrew, the Mamluks reclaimed the city and rebuilt its fortifications, not just against soldiers, but against betrayal. Within its narrow alleys, entire professions evolved around discretion. The Naqib al-Jassassin, a local intelligence officer, reported to the governor. Secret couriers carried coded letters between Damascus and Cairo, often disguised as traders or scholars. Even the craftsmen who repaired astrolabes and locks were sometimes employed to create devices for spies. False-bottom chests, miniature scroll tubes hidden inside walking sticks, and locks that required knowledge of multiple scripts to open. The scholars of Damascus, too, played a quiet part in this web of secrecy. Libraries like those of the Umayyad Mosque or the Al-Adaliyah Madrasa preserved not only theological texts but also treatises on statecraft and espionage. Some of these works, drawing on older Persian and Byzantine manuals, discussed surveillance and counterintelligence in veiled language, disguised as philosophical or moral instruction. It is said that even Ibn Taymiyyah, one of Damascus's most influential scholars of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, dealt with political intrigue during his life. His confrontations with the Mongols, his imprisonment under Mamluk authority, and his complex relations with rulers reveal a city constantly negotiating between faith and power. Damascus shaped men like him, intellectually sharp, politically aware, and wary of every ear that listened too closely. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars had made Damascus one of his administrative capitals, and under his rule, the city thrived as a secure link between Cairo and Aleppo. Caravanserais, like the Khan Azad Pasha, built later but on ancient foundations, functioned as centers not just of trade but of observation. Caravan leaders were questioned discreetly upon arrival. How many horses did they count at the border? What flags flew on the towers of neighboring towns? Such reports helped the Mamluk sultans maintain a mental map of the region's shifting powers. Yet beneath the empire's control, there was always resistance. Local nobles who had once aligned with Ayyubid princes or crusader lords found new ways to survive, some by selling information, others by forging new loyalties. The boundaries between loyalty and betrayal were fluid, and Damascus, ever pragmatic, adapted to whoever held power next. The artisans of the city carried traces of this uncertainty in their work. Damascene steel, famed for its swirling patterns, symbolized the city itself. Strong, layered, and made through fire and pressure. The calligraphers who etched Quranic verses onto metal also knew how to write invisible ink messages on parchment. The same hands that crafted beauty could craft deception. By the 14th century, Damascus had reached the height of its urban sophistication. The city's water channels sparkled under the sun, feeding fountains in courtyards shaded by citrus trees. But beneath this grace was a pulse of vigilance. The mutasib, the market inspector, not only checked weights and measures but also listened for rumors of rebellion. The city's peace depended as much on whispers as on swords. At night, from the citadel's walls, guards watched the torches flicker in the distance, marking the caravans that approached through the desert. They knew that with each caravan came not just goods, but stories, warnings, and sometimes lies. Damascus listened to them all, separating truth from deceit, shaping its survival through centuries of turbulence. The city of silk and spies was not a name spoken aloud in those days. It was an identity the city carried silently. It was a place where the threads of commerce and espionage intertwined so tightly that to pull one was to move the other. And even as empires rose and fell around it, Damascus endured, neither conquered in spirit nor careless in its secrets. The centuries passed, and the footsteps that once echoed through the marble corridors of Damascus began to fade into memory. The markets that had rung with the sounds of bargaining, of silk merchants unrolling shimmering bolts beneath the morning sun, grew quieter as empires changed hands. The fragrance of rosewater and cardamom still drifted through the air, but the whispers of spies had become the whispers of history. Damascus had survived too much to be defined by any one era. It had endured the Umayyads, the Abbasids, Crusaders, Mongols, and Mamluks, and later the Ottomans, who claimed it as one of the most prized jewels in their vast crown. Yet beneath every new rule, the city's soul remained the same. Cautious, elegant, enduring. Its walls had been rebuilt more than once, its mosques restored, its markets revived after fires and invasions. Each stone carried the mark of time, a record of survival through diplomacy as much as through resistance. For in Damascus, power was never merely about strength. It was about knowing what to hide and what to reveal. By the early Ottoman era, Damascus was a city of poets and pilgrims. The caravans to Mecca began their sacred journeys from its gates, the sound of prayer mingling with the jingle of camel bells. The espionage of old, those coded messages carried by traders and scholars, had given way to the quieter exchanges of ideas, of art, and of longing for the divine. But even then, the habits of discretion remained. Damascus never forgot its centuries of watching and listening. Its artisans continued to weave silk on looms whose designs had been unchanged for generations. The threads shimmered with blues, greens, and golds, colors that had once adorned princes and diplomats. The weavers worked in rhythm with the city's ancient heartbeat, each stroke of the shuttle echoing the patterns of time. To walk through the souks of Damascus was to walk through history itself, where every corner whispered stories of merchants and spies, of pilgrims and conquerors. The city's secret strength lay in its memory. While other cities crumbled or lost themselves in the noise of modernity, Damascus carried its past with quiet dignity. The old citadel still stood, its towers overlooking narrow lanes where once, long ago, coded messages had changed the course of wars. The Umayyad mosque still glowed at dusk, its mosaics reflecting light that had shone for over 1,000 years. And in the shadow of those ancient stones, the rhythm of life continued. The same water channels that once fed the fountains of caliphs still nourished the orange trees. The same call to prayer that had echoed in the days of Saladin still drifted across the rooftops at dawn. The sound carried a weight, the weight of memory, of history, and of survival. If one stood in the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque today, one could almost hear the layers of voices. Merchants calling out their wares in Arabic, Greek, Persian, the murmurs of scholars debating theology, the measured tone of an envoy delivering a warning to a sultan. The air itself seemed heavy with stories, as if Damascus were still listening. And perhaps it was. For a city that had thrived on secrets never truly stops listening. The same instincts that once guided its spies now live in its people's quiet resilience. Damascus watches as it always has, its eyes open, its spirit calm, its walls whispering to those who care to hear. It is easy to forget, in our age of speed and noise, how much of history was built on silence. In Damascus, silence was not emptiness. It was a language. A pause could save a life. A whisper could change the fate of an empire. The city learned early that truth and survival were twins born from the same quiet moment of understanding. So, as we leave the city now, its domes gleaming in the evening sun, the scent of jasmine curling through its ancient streets, we leave behind a place that has known the deepest rhythms of human history. The city of silk and spies still stands, wrapped in the layers of its own endurance. You can almost hear it. The faint rustle of silk, the low murmur of voices in the souk, the soft footsteps of those who came before. Traders, poets, rulers, and watchers in the dark. All have left their trace upon this land. Now, as the lamps are lit in the windows and the call to prayer fades into the twilight, imagine standing there for a moment longer. The air is warm, scented with spice and dust. The stones beneath your feet are smooth from centuries of passage. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and listen to the silence that carries the heartbeat of 1,000 years. Because in that silence lives Damascus, the eternal city, the city of silk and spies.